Okay, so Vicarious Resilience. So back in 2005, there was actually a research done specifically with therapists, but I think that it really channels into the different types of healthcare professionals out there. So in contrast to the, deleterious effects of trauma work captured in secondary trauma as well as vicarious trauma, these particular researchers had found that 86% of these particular therapists in their study sample said that their work with trauma survivor had led them to gains in areas such as sensitivity, compassion, insight, tolerance, and empathy. Therefore, part of that research showed that several therapists also reported that working with trauma survivors deepened their appreciation for the human spirit. So Arnold and Al label this phenomenon as vicarious post-traumatic growth for the simplicity of this presentation and what sort of the words and labels that I usually use as vicarious resilience. It's a little bit more cleaner and it is shorter, but vicarious post-traumatic growth or vicarious resiliency in some ways are two of the same. So similarly, another research had also argued that trauma work enriches workers' lives. It increases their appreciation of life and their understanding of themselves and others. And it enabled them to form new relationships and deepen existing relationships. They also contended that working with trauma survivors can lead to personal growth, deepening of relationship with others, and increase personal experiences and enhance awareness of many dimensions of life. So bottom line is that even though that there are some significant risk factors associated to the work that we do, especially when we do work with individuals that may have a background of trauma, they may still be living within a traumatic experience, or also as we are all experiencing this global pandemic, as well as the uprising of historically of these racial injustices as well, we continue to experience these global traumatic experiences. But with that, when reflected appropriately and being able to really very intentionally work through these, we can recreate a new meaning to these experiences, and out of this we can very much grow as practitioners. So some of the individual protective factors when it relates to when we are able and capable of building vicarious resilience includes items such as, so two in particular would be expression of feelings and compassion satisfaction. So expression of feelings in mental health, one of the most common goals for client patients, whether children or adults, is being able to identify and express feelings. We know the value of this and the cost of keeping feelings in or ignoring feelings. So as healthcare providers or frontline workers, this may also be something that can be really helpful for us if we find a way of being able to express our feelings, whether it be through peer support, through a trusted friend or a supervisor that may have that role of debrief, or if those are not available, seeking out external support such as a therapist, etc. Then there's compassion satisfaction. It's important to note that although there are risks to those working in the helping field, there's also a great deal of satisfaction that one can derive from this work. This is referred to as compassion satisfaction, which can be defined as a positive feelings derived from one's ability to help others to contribute to society and achieve well-being. It is believed that compassionate satisfaction is a protective factor that prevents burnout, compassionate fatigue, as well as vicarious trauma. People who work with trauma survivors have identified personal growth, spiritual connection, hope, and respect for human resiliency as a positive outcome of their work. This really ensures individual and organizational protective factors are in place, will enhance that compassionate satisfaction. So it's really important that we recognize the individual as well as the organizational protective factors that can be put in place in order to promote compassionate satisfaction. So factors that maintain vicarious resilience, there's self-awareness, right? So if one is self-aware, stresses and pressures are identified early. So some of the questions to ask ourselves are, do you know your strengths and weaknesses? Are you aware of the belief system and how you are impacted by different people at different times? Being able to ask for help and or get support. The days of grin and bear it and suck it up need to be banished. Those who try to keep everything inside or hide from others tend to turn into hidden volcanoes, eventually erupting, but with much greater fierceness. Client and patient safety is needed in order to foster open communication and a helping relationship. These same beliefs also apply to us as healthcare providers. Balance between home and work. The basis of prevention is balance. When our home and work life are in balance, our body and our minds are more likely to be in balance. Exposure to trauma can push at us so we move out of balance with ourselves, with others, and or even within our environments. Do you only talk about work even at home? Can you enjoy time watching TV with a family member without thinking about what you have to do tomorrow at work? Is it difficult to watch shows depicting suffering or dysfunction? When these things happen, it may be a sign that you are out of balance and at higher risk of vicarious trauma. Personal strategies in place for self-care. Personal strategies for self-care can include an exercise program, a hobby, or being a volunteer. If you can name 3 things that you do for self-care every week, you're probably in pretty good shape. If you can't, then this may be a key area for you to consider. We're going to be looking at further down the slides, the difference between self-comfort as well as self-care. So just keep that as a note. Many people have a list of personal strategies, but it's concerning how many don't actually use them on a regular basis. So in order for us to care for others, we also need to be able to care for ourselves. Being open to learning and growing. Given adequate salaries, research has shown that learning and gaining new knowledge are great motivators for most people. This can happen through reading, supervision, team consultation, professional development, gaining more experience, or taking on new roles and or responsibilities. When we feel that we have a purpose or we feel that there's a new challenge up ahead that we feel really confident about, that grows our compassion satisfaction. And it also grows our interest of wanting to do more within our organization or to explore and be open to learning and growth. Being optimistic. Is the glass half full or half empty? Research has helped to identify the risk associated with being pessimistic and the benefits of being optimistic. And this doesn't necessarily mean being naive to the realities of the challenges that we have within the world, but it's about being able to see both sides. That even though that you can honor yourself and have self-compassion for the sides that may be sufferance and pain, that you can also be optimistic in seeing that there can be an opportunity for growth in the future. And then finally, able to set boundaries at work and at home. Can you turn down work or plan a vacation and take it? Knowing what you can do without stressing or distressing yourself is a healthy protective factor. However, this does not mean you never extend yourself, never take on an extra task, or always put your needs in front of others. Setting boundaries is related to balance and being able to know when you are able to push yourself and when you need to pull back. So here are some reflective questions, and at the same time, on the table here, there are the individual factors as well as the environmental factors to keep note. So Yasin back in 1995 saw that prevention as a multi-pronged approach, encompassing strategies at the individual level, so what our personal as well as our professional needs are, as well as the strategies at the environmental level, so societal as well as organizational. So the framework that you see on this slide is really helpful for planning that addresses the impact of vicarious trauma. So really looking at, on an individual level, personal, what type of physical and psychological and social needs are needed there. And then in terms of professional, what are those protective factors that need to be in place as well? When you look at environmental, you look at societal. So what are the environmental things? So sometimes it's outside of our organizations, like policies, legislations, and social actions, versus your work setting. So how is your physical setting, your core values at work, and do they reflect the same core values you have as a professional? What are your roles and what are the policies and procedures? What type of training and professional development opportunities? So to the side, we have a couple reflective questions to kind of think about as we talk about vicarious resilience today, of thinking about, what do we think about when we hear the terms burnout or vicarious trauma or secondary trauma? And how are they different? Have you or others experienced any of these things? And do you reflect on how you feel and how you're functioning in your life, whether at home or at work? So these questions can also be helpful as a preventative factor in order to just keep the idea intentional and within your consciousness. Because oftentimes, and as we talked before, oftentimes we experience a lot of things that is sort of like a vacuum coming in. And oftentimes we are really just intentional about that 5 to 10%. So if we forget at times that other 90% can also take in information and can also influence subconsciously whether we become at risk of burnout, vicarious trauma, or secondary trauma, it's worth to keep those reminders in terms of how are they different and how do they relate to myself or relate to others? And how do I reflect on how I feel that I'm functioning in my life? So how helpful are the strategies I have in place right now for my well-being in general? So self-compassion and intentional self-care. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So that was from Remen in 2006. And I think that resonates a lot when we tend to focus on, as healthcare providers, oftentimes we feel that the reasons why we work in the work that we work in is not only because we're passionate about it, but also that we've built some kind of resilience or maybe perhaps also tolerance. But I think that it's really important for us to recognize that at the end of the day, we are still human. And that if we believe that going through and being empathetic towards other people and supporting other people means that we would not necessarily be impacted by their suffering and pain and the suffering and pain of human beings and the suffering and pain that we go through, that on its own is going to create a lot of risk factors and blind spots. So I'm sure that we've all heard the saying, you are your own worst critic. And it is very true that most of us are really hard on ourselves, particularly if we get even the slightest hint that we aren't matching up in some way in our achievements, our career, or perhaps in our studying, our social standing, our relationships, maybe sometimes our appearance, our body image, our financial status, etc. If we make even the minutest mistake, then we have a tendency to berate ourselves. And if we make a big mistake, this can lead to severe distress, worry, and even panic. People seem to find it hard, and for some, almost impossible, to treat or speak to ourselves in a kind or caring manner. In fact, some recoil from the idea of it, like they were being asked to do something repulsive or painful. If you identify with being your own harshest critic, then understanding the journey from self-criticism to self-kindness can definitely benefit you. So what is self-compassion? So for those of you who may not have had the opportunity to go through our self-compassion webinar, some of this information might be sort of double for you. So what is self-compassion? So first, to define self-compassion, we really need to start with what compassion means. And compassion is really an attitude, the same way self-criticism is an attitude. But when we think about compassion, it's an attitude that involves a variety of feelings, different types of thoughts, motives, desires, urges, as well as behaviors that can really be directed towards any being. So whether it's ourselves, another person, animals, a society, the environment. So when we talk about self-compassion, we're really specifically talking about our attitude towards ourselves. Self-compassion itself uses mindfulness, self-kindness, and connectedness to manifest unconditional views towards ourselves, giving us the sense that we have unconditional worth, unconditional love, and kindness towards ourselves. Paul Gilbert, as well as Kristen Neff, are two leading figures in that area of building self-compassion. And as such, their teachings emphasize on 4 key things to consider while practicing self-compassion. So part of self-compassion, as I mentioned, is about connectiveness as well, self-kindness, as well as mindfulness. So the 4 key points that these 2 individuals had identified were awareness, normalizing, kindness, and alleviation. So when we're talking about awareness, we're really talking about being attentive or sensitive to the fact that some sort of suffering is occurring. Now, the sufferance could mean some distressing struggles with emotional pain, mental pain, physical pain, or all of the above. When we're able to be aware of this, or when we're able to bring our attention to that 5 to 10% instead of being reactive based on that 90%, which is at our subconscious, we then give ourselves the opportunity to begin the process of normalizing. So when we talk about normalizing, we're talking about recognizing that experiencing this sort of pain is universal. We all experience pain at some point to a varying degree. My sufferance and pain will be different than my colleague's sufferance and pain. But it doesn't necessarily mean that mine is worse than another. It simply just means that universally we are all susceptible to that pain. The fact that we experience pain isn't a fault or a failing of ours. We're not to blame for our pain, and we're not alone in our pain. It's part of what it is to be a human being. But when we can recognize that depending on the circumstances, it will be varying degrees, it allows us to normalize that the experiences that we are feeling are normal for the circumstances that we're in. But if we're not aware or attentive to the circumstances we're in, then most likely self-criticism will continue to perpetuate. So once you're able to be aware and you're able to bring some kind of normalcy to it by saying, it is what it is, it's a common response to the circumstance I'm in, then it gives yourself that opportunity to then move into kindness. And kindness, yes, it's about, meeting yourself with kindness, care, and warmth. But it's also about not shying away from or ignoring the pain. Oftentimes people think that emotions are sort of like hot and cold. So if you feel cold, you put a sweater on. If you feel warm, you take that sweater off. But emotions are very much different, that when you try to remove yourself from it, it tends to just get either worse or louder. Emotions is required to kind of sit with it and allow yourself to sort of welcome it with curiosity versus with threat. Because oftentimes those emotions is your body's way to communicate to you. And in sort of like the same thing as if you think about as a child, children sometimes are not able to put words associated to what their needs are. So they may react in particular ways. And sometimes we misunderstand them by thinking, they're being delinquent or they're whining or etc. But really, that is their only way of communicating to us that there is a need not being met. So that's the same for us as our emotions. So the next time we feel anxious or sad or mad, it might be helpful to recognize being aware of it, to normalize the circumstance, and then to create some kind of kindness towards ourselves where we can really meet the emotion where it's at and try to better understand what it's trying to communicate. Then it goes into alleviation. And alleviation is really about focusing your energy on ways to alleviate the pain, which may be via providing further comfort or caring action. So whether it's self-comfort or self-care. And it's also about trying to provide yourself with helpful perspectives regarding whatever the trouble is, or having the strength and courage to take other necessary actions to address the problems being faced. Self-compassion is about doing all of these 4 things for ourselves when we're struggling, like being aware of our own pain, whatever that may be. Understanding that while feeling this pain is hard, this is a normal human experience, not a failing on our part, and we are not alone in this. It then involves directing feelings of kindness and care towards ourselves, just as we might to someone else we care about who's struggling. And finally, focusing on our attention and energy on how we might improve our own pain and move through the struggles we're facing. So it's really important to also recognize that when you begin the practice of self-compassion, it may not work right away, because you also have to be able to keep in consideration in what intentional moment are you. Because if you're already outside of what we call your window of tolerance, or you're already sort of near the edge of your drive system, most likely self-compassion will be even harder to apply in those circumstances. So I often tell individuals what can be really helpful is to try to practice self-compassion when things are not so much of a struggle. That the more that you practice this, the more that it becomes second nature. And if you can make it second nature, then when you are in distressing situations or you are struggling and that part of that brain kind of shuts off, you might still have that option of being self-compassionate towards yourself. So self-compassion can bring great benefits for our mental health as well as our well-being. Particularly, self-compassion can activate our soothe system, which calms our threat system as well as our drive system. So our threat system is a system that would be responsible for detecting potential dangers in order to protect ourselves. That danger at times are perceived dangers, or they may be dangers such as feeling a sense that, people are judging you, or that you may make a mistake, or your appearance in terms of society might not look as well. So the threat system is no longer sort of that fear that there's a bear, right? Oftentimes our threat system is activated based on societal beliefs. Then you have your drive system, which kind of spurs us to get things done and be active in life. But if we forget what the meaning of our drive system is for, oftentimes we can lead into believing that we need to fix something, or that we need to work through something that really just needs self-compassion. So once we lose meaning of the drive system, then it kind of goes into overactive, and then it falls into our threat system. It's really important to note that without our soothe system, our threat and drive system do become overactive and can lead to difficult emotions such as anxiety, anger, depression. Therefore, self-compassion plays a vital role in helping to balance those emotions. The need to receive care and nurturing evolved as a strong need within all mammals, including humans. Being cared for from birth is vital to our survival, and without it, we struggle to strive. Some of us have unfortunately experienced what we call adverse childhood experiences. As a result of these adversities, our stress response and threat system are overactive. Some of us, all the time, or others for the smallest circumstances. Alternatively, The success of the human race as a species has depended on us receiving care and being motivated to give care to other beings. In reflection with the pandemic that we're all experiencing globally, as well as the racial injustices that continue to happen, now is really the time where self-compassion can benefit us the most. When self-compassion is working well, we work together, we support each other, we flourish, and we have resilience. When we struggle with self-compassion, we're suffering internally. Sufferance can create instances of intolerance to situations that threat our worth. Things like unhelpful thoughts about ourselves, perceived failures, risky behaviors, beliefs created by adverse experiences, as well as violence. When we give ourselves permission to be kind towards ourselves, we literally give our body a release of oxytocin. This hormone, which is also shown to release when parent and child bond, or even human and dog companion, this hormone promotes bonding and closeness, and particularly active when we find ourselves being nurtured. So for those of you who may have experienced childhood adversities, rejection, abandonment, or violence, when you practice self-compassion, you invoke nurturing for yourself. This can help heal past injuries from those adverse experiences. When I said that self-compassion helps balance out emotions, it was meant in the literal sense that it releases oxytocin, which calms individuals. On the outside, this may be seen as making healthy choices for your well-being, including self-care, self-comfort when intentional, setting boundaries, intentionally following your values, eating mindfully, as well as having healthy relationships. It's also important to recognize that sometimes, such as our very real and very current situation, it may become hard to practice self-compassion, as I've described. Understanding how your threat system is overactive can help you practice self-compassion when you recognize whether the threat is perceived or real. So an example, our threat systems activated enough to help us respond to the pandemic by individually taking precautions such as practicing social distancing or physical distancing, washing our hands throughoutly, and staying informed through trusted sources such as the Center of Disease and Control, our World Health Organization, or even local trusted media. Self-compassion can help us buffer the system working overtime. Misinterpretations or perceived beliefs can ignite the threat system. Your own drive system is another system that's worth understanding as well. So we know that our soothe system helps reduce unhelpful outcomes of an overactive threat or drive, but some of us might wonder, isn't the drive system helpful for us? And I had explained it previously. So since it motivates us to get things done and to be active in life, and it's absolutely that it can be really helpful for us. But at the same time, things like I mentioned before, the societal views, our perceptions, and distorted beliefs, we also risk working this system over time, and it can become exhausted by the need to achieve and the fear of failure. So recognizing your tolerance of your drive system can help bring good mental health and well-being. Feeling bad about ourselves for whatever reason should be a flag that one of these systems is creeping up to become overactive. Knowing when your soothe system is activated, or when you're within your window of tolerance, or that you are being your authentic self, can really help to bring that good mental health and well-being, and it can really be helpful. This helps build a foundation to which you recognize the various thoughts, feelings, and behaviors associated to being in the soothe system. An example of experiencing your activated soothe system could be when you are relaxing or feeling nurtured. Your threat system and soothe system can't be activated at once, and your drive system and soothe system can't be activated at once either. This is sort of an opportunity during our physical distancing practices, and for most of us that may still be working from home, that we can practice our soothe techniques to calm our threat system and drive system by being self-compassionate. This is also another opportunity that when you start focusing on what are some self-care practices that you can put in place of incorporating, how can you start being more attentive and intentional about bringing yourself or practicing being able to bring yourself back into your soothe system. So why is it so hard for us to be compassionate with ourselves? It often leads to four main items, but there are really three main items that continue to kind of get us stuck in that self-criticism cycle. So being self-compassionate is hard for most of us for various reasons. So our early life experiences, like we mentioned before, if we have significant childhood adversities, that can definitely play a role. But most importantly, when we think about our early life experiences, we might not have been taught or shown how to be compassionate towards ourselves. Although we are able to be compassionate, if we're not taught, given, or shown compassion, we risk being unaware of our rights to compassion and kindness. It might just not be the norm for us. Then there's a threat system, as I mentioned in the two last slides. Our brain is hardwired to shift into threat mode easily to protect ourselves. Seeing the negative is our default attention bias. So turning our attention to more self-compassionate endeavors might not be something that comes naturally to us. And if you add early life experiences, that just makes it a little bit harder because it's already hard enough for us to intentionally turn our attention to being more self-compassionate. Then there's a lack of awareness. When we're unaware that we're struggling or unaware of our unhelpful beliefs and behaviors towards ourselves, perhaps because we built a tolerance to it or we've suppressed it for so long, we tend to manifest deep-seated beliefs that have us going through life almost on autopilot, doing what we have always done and have never really taken the time to assess how we talk to ourselves. It may never even have occurred to us that we may not have been treating ourselves kindly and that we have the option to do so. And then finally, having a negative belief about self-compassion. When we're taught differently or when the benefits of self-compassion aren't talked about a lot, we might create negative beliefs about self-compassion. After all, we are just human, so we like predictability, we like certainty. If we can be certain that there is no benefit to self-compassion, then your choices can become more predictable. When predictable, as mentioned earlier, it can create autopilot beliefs. Some of these beliefs can have us thinking that maybe being self-compassionate is too touchy-feely or too lazy or self-pity or even greedy. The reality is that self-compassion isn't any of those things. Self-compassion is honoring our authentic self, giving yourself permission to experience good mental health, wellness, and truly being a human being. So thoughts like, I'm such an idiot, or I can't believe I did that. I am so useless. I need to do better. I should be doing better. Other people don't make such stupid mistakes. I'm just not careful enough. I've never been careful enough, and now I'm failing and getting what I deserve. Sometimes when we think that way, or maybe some of these things are things that you've thought about yourself or that you've flat out told yourself. And I think that we can all agree that when we hear it intentionally like this is an unhelpful way of talking to ourselves and definitely does not promote self-compassion. The tricky part is that when we do think these things or say these things to ourselves, we often may not realize that the motivation behind it is from a belief that self-criticism carries some benefit. Our minds aren't stupid and they don't do things for no good reason. Self-criticism usually occurs to fulfill at least one of two main aims, either self-improvement or self-punishment. So self-improvement in this reasoning, self-criticism often occurs as an attempt at self-correction. It can be seen as an opportunity to highlight weaknesses and fixing them. It can be perceived as an encouragement to better ourselves, motivate ourselves, push ourselves to do better, be stronger, stop mistakes, or address flaws. So most probably your drive system would be activated when your self-criticism is pushing to self-improvement for your outcome. Self-punishment is basically when we experience a sense of low self-worth. We may subconsciously believe and consciously behave as though we are bad people or have done bad. In this particular reasoning, we often result in punishing ourselves. The most fascinating part is that if there is no one else to dish out the punishment, then we kind of dish it out for ourselves. How many times have you said those statements to yourself in the last couple of weeks so far? Just get over it. Just think positive. You're overreacting. Calm down. These are statements of distorted beliefs. If you think about it, if we give up being self-critical and instead are more self-compassionate, we may fear a negative backlash. Others fear the unknown of what if things get worse? What if I fail? What if I can't control it? There are a lot of misconceptions about what self-compassion truly involves. Some unfortunately have the impression that self-compassion equals being weak. Others see it as equating to self-pity and self-stepping, having to take responsibility in life. To address these misconceptions we may have about self-compassion, we need to come back to the definition of what true self-compassion is in the first place. One way of doing this is thinking of people that you consider to be compassionate human beings. Compare these individuals to the distorted beliefs. Are these people lazy? Are they self-indulgent? Are they self-absorbed? Are they undisciplined? Do they lack control? Probably not. In order to be able to respond to ourselves compassionately, we need to be aware that we are struggling in the first place. We need to be aware when our mind leaps into self-critical thinking, which only causes us to manifest our struggles even more. Slowing ourselves down in order to see the whirlwind direction we may be falling into. Without being able to slow down or becoming aware, we can't make choices to try something different, to try a new compassionate approach. The different strategies shown here will likely not work without first slowing down and becoming aware of what is happening with you. Breathing plays an important role when it comes to our physical and emotional state. When we're triggered or that our threat system is overactive, this can activate our sympathetic system. This system is responsible for revving up our body. That means our breathing rate can get faster and a number of other physiological changes begin. This is to help us fight, flight, or freeze. So we're slowing breathing. Practicing breathing techniques slows the mind and body down from threat mode into self-soothe mode. There are several different styles of deep breathing experiences, but one that I tend to utilize with my clients in sessions is the 4-7-8 method. So you inhale through your nose for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 7, and then exhaled with puckered lips for 8 seconds. This gets repeated a few times until you have a calm and clear head. Oftentimes it's about like 4 times that you do it, and then you start noticing a difference in your body. It is also adjustable to individuals' needs and breathing capacity. So if 4-7-8 is too much to hold in and to blow out, you can always shorten those seconds. Attention retraining. How we think of a situation contributes to both our self-criticism and self-compassion. In order to train ourselves into developing more self-compassion, we need to train ourselves into catching our thoughts regarding this situation. Have you caught yourself saying, just get over it, or calm down this week? 9 times out of 10, we say these statements automatically to ourselves without even realizing it. When we start bringing attention to these statements, then we can redirect them into more positive statements to ourselves, like, it's okay not to be calm, or I don't have it to get over it right this second. Mundane task focusing. How can focusing on mundane tasks like housework help us to develop more self-compassion? Mundane tasks help us redirect our attention and take notice of what you are doing in the present moment. Do you notice your mind wanders? Are you being self-critical with the task that you're doing? Activate your 5 senses, your touch, your sight, your sound, your smell, and your taste. Bring the focus back to paying attention to what you're doing in a non-judgmental way. Meditation. This practice helps train ourselves in becoming more aware of our surroundings and what your attention may get caught up in. This helps redirect your thoughts in a beneficial manner. Oftentimes people say, meditation doesn't really work for me because I can't just be in that present moment. There's so many thoughts that cross through, right? But that is the part and point of meditation, is to allow yourself to becoming more aware of your surroundings and to pay attention to what are those types of thoughts coming in and out. And then eventually being able to practice of saying, how helpful are these thoughts for me in this present moment? And kind of giving yourself permission to kind of redirect those thoughts outside in order to kind of bring yourself back to that present moment or back to paying attention to your breath, etc. So meditation does take practice, but having your mind, full doesn't necessarily mean you're not succeeding at meditation. The purpose of it is the process that leads to meditation that is helpful. And finally, practice, practice, practice. The title really says it all. You can't get better at something if you don't practice. Be gentle with yourself. It does take time to develop these self-compassionate skills, especially if they were never taught to you. But it can happen. All you need to do is to practice. So when you participate and you practice these 5 actions, they can support you in your journey towards living compassionately with yourself. So self-care versus self-comfort. Self-loving activities can be a great way to show loving yourself. However, some of those activities can lead to unhelpful strategies that leave you caring for yourself in ways to distract, numb, or avoid. At that point, it's time to pause by asking yourself, what am I truly needing in this moment? Is it comfort or care? Being intentional about self-care means listening to your body. Perhaps you're soothing yourself from a stressful day or an overwhelming month. Maybe you're comforting yourself after a hard conversation with a patient or a client, or you're having an argument with your partner. You could be pampering yourself after a week of doing everything for everyone else, or rewarding yourself for a job well done. Reacting by comforting yourself in itself is neither good or bad. The intention behind the action is where there can be misleading messages from distraction, numbing, and avoidance. Think about a time or situation that you needed comfort. How did you comfort yourself? Did you comfort yourself with a hot bath, a glass of wine, perhaps sweet and salty treats? Maybe fruits and vegetables or nut snacks, perhaps sex or TV shows, early bedtime, pedicure, cannabis, social media, nap, shop online, a massage. When we validate our need for care, we are looking for self-respect, connection, and balance. When we give ourselves permission to experience intentional self-care, we give ourselves the kindness to honor our strengths and values. Practicing intentional self-care is not based on choices that are convenient or easy, but they are in line with your authentic self. You are respecting your right to be happy, to be fulfilled, and to be present. So what are some common types of situations that you need comfort? How do you care for yourself? Are you writing in your journal, having interpersonal chat with someone you trust, creating something, declaring your gratitude, taking yourself on a walk outside, doing yoga, perhaps cooking a beautiful meal, gazing at the stars, having that conversation you've been avoiding, meditate, getting lost in your favorite hobby, or dancing. Then there's sort of that reflective practice. So I guess the point meaning in terms of self-care and self-comfort is the intention behind it. It's really helpful to find comfort, and it is really helpful to find self-care. But oftentimes when you've chosen comfort, perhaps when you needed care, right? So there is a moment of choice where you can make a deliberate decision. Since both are necessary, it does help to be reflective in your actions. So when you turn your attention to what you're doing and why, you're giving yourself permission to be curious about what you're feeling and the choice to do what you actually need. Some of our comfort acts have been helpful during the past adversities or stressful circumstances. When it becomes your go-to, it can skip right to that choice without giving you the chance to reflect and realize maybe you just need to practice intentional self-care. It can be helpful, getting at times immediate relief. However, it can soon turn into an unhelpful outcome in the long term. So when are times that you've chosen comfort when you really need a care? Or perhaps, what are the healthiest forms of comfort for you? How can you remind yourself to make intentional decisions next time you feel overwhelmed, stressed, lonely, lost, or frustrated? So remember self-compassion. If you've been sliding into the land of distraction, numbness, excessive soothing at the expense of your values, it's okay. Practice some self-compassion and let that day be a reset button. These 3 thoughts can help bring yourself back to your intentions. Breathing is a form of patience, and patience is a form of wisdom. It demonstrates that we understand and accept that sometimes things must unfold in their own time. We cultivate our attention towards our minds and bodies when we practice mindfulness. We intentionally remind ourselves that there is no need to react because we find the mind judging all the time, or because we're agitated or frightened or anxious, or because we have been practicing for a while and nothing seems to be happening. We give ourselves room to have these experiences and breathe. Trust. In practicing mindfulness as well as self-compassion, you're practicing taking responsibility for being yourself and learning to listen to and trust your own being. The more you cultivate this trust in yourself, the easier you will find it will be to trust other people more and to see their basic goodness as well. It is far better to trust your own intuition than to look outside yourself for guidance, even if you make some mistakes along the way. Let go. When we start paying attention to our inner experience, we rapidly discover that there are certain thoughts, feelings, and situations that the mind seems to want to hold on to. If they're pleasant, we try to prolong these thoughts or feelings or situations, stretch them out, and conjure them over and over. Similarly, there are many thoughts and feelings and experiences that we try to get rid of or prevent ourselves from having because they are unpleasant. Maybe they're painful or frightening in one way or another, and we want to protect ourselves from them. In the meditation practice, we intentionally put aside the tendency to elevate some aspect of our experience and reject others. Instead, We just let our experience be what it is and practice observing it from moment to moment. Letting go is a way of letting things be, of accepting things as they are. So becoming aware and allowing that normalization. And when you're able to do that, then you're able to welcome kindness. Letting go is not such a foreign experience. We do it every single night when we go to sleep. We lie down on a padded surface with the lights out in a quiet place, and we let go of our mind and body. If you can't let go, you can't go to sleep. Most of us have experienced times when the mind just would not shut down when we go into bed. This is one of the first signs of elevated stress. At these times, we may be unable to free ourselves from certain thoughts because our involvement in them is just too powerful. If we try to force ourselves to sleep, it only makes things worse. So if you can go to sleep, you're already an expert at letting go. Now we just need to practice applying this skill in the real situations as well. So that brings us to the end of our workshop. It was a pleasure sharing our team's knowledge in vicarious resilience. We hope you've learned some new skills or this has helped ponder further self-reflection. At this time, I'm going to welcome any questions or discussions, as well as to just please stay engaged through our website, our Facebook page, or even continuing to follow CMHA of New Brunswick. For those of you who need to scoot out, have a mindful evening, and thank you so much. Those of you that can stay, I'm just going to flip on my video and shut the PowerPoint here, and we can have a discussion. So are there any questions about the presentation or about vicarious resilience, about vicarious trauma, about anything related to trauma or anything related to mental health? Sort of the platform is yours. So you can either send a message through the messenger, through the chat, or you can send a Q&A. If you're uncomfortable, you can also send an anonymous Q&A. And then I'll go through those questions and answer to the best of my ability. So I'll give it a couple minutes. And maybe we need a couple minutes to kind of reflect on what we just went through, because we did talk about self-comfort versus self-care. Oftentimes we do a really good job sometimes of providing ourselves with comfort, but when we lose intentions behind it, it can easily kind of slip into that vicious cycle of I'm just trying to avoid, or I'm trying to numb, or I'm trying to isolate myself. We talked about vicarious resilience and a little bit about the research behind that how helpful it can become in transforming sort of the experiences of the healthcare professional as well as the frontline worker. And we also looked at self-compassion. So we do have a question here. So how can we strengthen vicarious resilience at this time of the racism pandemic, given the events of the past weeks in the US? So that's a really good question. At this point, I think that depending on, who this individual is, whether you are a white individual or racialized individual, if you are racialized, I think that it's important to recognize that this has been happening historically. So this is not necessarily something that is new, but it is profound in the sense that each situation that happens obviously creates re-traumatization for those that are racialized. For those that are from as a white person, it can become really discerning because oftentimes, and a lot of white people are allies. So experiencing this on already turbulent platforms such as the pandemic that just took place, even before that, there were conversations about climate change, and before that, conversations around Indigenous women and all these different things. So Really, it's really about looking and reflecting within yourself, of being aware of the sufferings and pain that you're going through, and trying to normalize it in the sense of not necessarily normalizing of like, okay, this is what's happening in the world, but normalizing the fact that we're all in this together to a spectrum or another, right? And to do the best that you can to see what can I as an individual do in order to show up or to be supportive. So most definitely educating yourself and really reflecting upon, what are my values and perhaps what of my blind spots. It's the same thing in terms of vicarious trauma. Oftentimes we don't realize that we're within vicarious trauma until we actually start practicing reflective practice by asking ourselves, what am I doing and why am I doing it? What are the values behind this? Am I burnt out? And all these different things. So education is definitely key. For some of you, if you're interested in learning more about that, I know that I'm delivering a webinar on Friday around race and privilege. And then in a couple weeks, we'll be also talking about the history of white privilege. That can be really helpful, just bringing that dialogue and that conversation. But really, in terms of strengthening that vicarious resilience, is about being aware, and also depending on which group, whether you're racialized or that you're a part of the group of Caucasians, of being able to kind of just be honest with yourselves that there is history there, that even though that you are an ally, there's still blind spots and subconscious influences that are just systemically there. The same situation as having adverse childhood experiences, right? It isn't necessarily your fault, and you are not to blame, because this is a historical thing that has continued to happen since at least the 15th century, right? So it's really just about doing the best you can, that if you disagree with the things that are happening and things feel really overwhelming, to not be afraid to talk about it. And if you're unsure, to ask and to try to have those dialogue with trusted people. So I hope that kind of answers it. It is still, it depends on the circumstance, but I hope I was able to kind of answer that question for you. Oh, you're very welcome. So any other questions? It's sort of like we just keep getting experience after experience, right? We think that we're kind of working through this pandemic in terms of the coronavirus, and then we have another pandemic in terms of our societal structure, right? So I think this is also the opportunity as humans that, this is, I guess, we're being tested in terms of our resiliency. So we're definitely all in this together globally, which is something I think very new that globally we're all experiencing, from the pandemics to the racial injustices to the way that our neighbors are behaving, to everything. So yeah. Any further questions about mental health, trauma, resiliency? Yeah, anything at all. I'm going to write once again my email in the chat, just in case that some of you might have questions later on. I really appreciate everyone's participation and being here and listening to myself as well as Ashley. I hope a lot of the materials was helpful, or at least pondered further reflection. I know that the workbooks, if putting it together and being really vulnerable about it and reflective about it, can become really helpful for you. If you feel that you want to continue that conversation as well, we always welcome you to register for the counseling clinic by reaching out to CMHA of New Brunswick, and they would be gladly to assign you to our therapists that are available. And then you get to have that that 45-minute session, and then from there you can continue to work further with that therapist or select a different therapist in terms of working through that. So sometimes that can be helpful, especially just as a maintenance sometimes, because sometimes when we're in the healthcare profession, we do have a little bit more resilience and tolerance than most, because we're kind of intentional about the work that we do. But it can always be helpful to give ourselves that self-care. I know myself as a clinical traumatologist, even though that I do specialize in trauma and all those things, I do still try to have a maintenance of therapy in order to kind of just be able to kind of let some stuff out and just make sure that I'm checking in to make sure that I'm intentional about the blind spots that I have, right? And that those blind spots, I can be kind to myself. And oftentimes we need someone from the outside to let us know those things, right? Oh, I'm very glad that this was really helpful for you. This is sort of part of what we want to make sure that we can bring that awareness to everyone. Excellent. Well, it seems to me that everyone kind of got the benefit out of this webinar. So if that is it, I'm going to say happy evening to everyone. And by any means, continue to check out what CMHA of New Brunswick has. Make sure that you like our Breelove Counselling page and check out the different webinars that are happening there as well. We do have groups on Ask a Therapist, Ask a Clinical Traumatologist, as well as Ask a art therapist as well. So if that is the end, be well. Take care.